Matt, thanks for joining us today to continue the discussions that we're having on machine behavior. And in these discussions, we talk about the focus and study of AI agents as black boxes, kind of leveraging some of the techniques that we have from the social and natural sciences to study behavioral agents. And these discussions have led us into a broad variety of different topics, all of which have been fascinating. And I'm excited to have you here today to talk about your great work. You do a lot of work on human social networks. In fact, you have a book coming out soon on that topic. Could you tell us a little bit about your work on networks and why you think networks are important to humans, what they do in our lives, and just generally kind of overview some of your work on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess what makes humans special. We're social animals.
Yeah.
We depend on other people for all sorts of things, and I guess the point of the book is that we are embedded in networks, and who your friends are make a difference in whether you get jobs, what kind of information you have, what opinions you form, what clothes you wear, all sorts of things, and it's easy to take that for granted. And I guess I've been studying this for years now, and I think part of the reason for writing the book is that there are systematic things that we can say about the way the network structure matters, and so we can actually understand human behavior better, much better in the light of understanding social structures and how they emerge and how they influence our decisions.
So I have a degree in economics as an undergrad, and I've done a little bit of work in that area. For a long time, economics didn't really consider networks very much when they were doing some of their microeconometric studies. Is that changing? And do you think that it's changing fast enough?
Yeah.
Would you like to see it changing faster? Yeah, what are your thoughts
I mean,
on
I
that?
think it's changing now because we have more tools than we used to have, and the ability to understand and measure these things and to study them has really advanced. The era of big data makes our footprints in the world. Every time you go on a social media platform, who you're talking to, your emails, your phone calls, your likes and dislikes, which things you browse, all that's recorded. That's all out there. We can see what people are doing. We can see what decisions they make. We can understand people much better in that context, and it makes a big difference in trying to predict behavior and understand why people make the choices they do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So networks are very interesting to me for a variety of reasons, but for one of the reasons is we've had social networks since the dawn of our species, basically. Yeah. But you mentioned something that is a very interesting change in the way that we conduct ourselves on those networks with the advent of social media. Do you think that social media has changed human social networks in any important ways? If so, what do you think those ways are?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main themes I have in this book is trying to understand. Let's think of two main changes that are happening in the world these days. So one is that the fact that you can communicate at a distance means that you can maintain relationships that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Yeah. So I can Skype with my family when I'm traveling in Europe or Asia. I can keep up with friends from high school who I haven't seen in a long time, and talk with them.
Right.
I'm in touch with many more people. So you can, on the one hand, that means that we're becoming more connected, and the world's globalizing, and everybody's in touch with everybody, and you can think of culture spreading and all sorts of wonderful things happening. Sure. At the same time, there's a more pernicious force, which I think is the fact that you can find other people who are much like yourself, right? So homophily, exactly. This idea that you can be looking out, and I can locate people who think exactly like I do, and I can start communicating with them. Yeah. So on the one hand, our networks can become denser and more connected. The other side is we could also become more segregated and more stratified and more echo chambery. Yeah. All these things can be happening at the same time, and that leads to sort of a strange set of changes in the world.
For sure. So one of the things you talk about in a lot of your work is the importance of network structure on outcomes in the network and outcomes for humans. And one of those concepts is sort of centrality. And the more central you are in a network, perhaps the more influential you are able to be, the more you're able to get your ideas out there, perhaps.
Right.
And one of the things I've wondered is, are the AI algorithms that are behind, for example, Facebook's news feed and Twitter's news feed now, are they somewhat changing the importance of one's structure in the network? So if an algorithm can go out and it can find content that it thinks is likely to be very successful content, regardless of the structure of the network, can I then, on the periphery of that network, influence discussion much more than I might have been able to in settings where my network structure meant that I didn't have really the ties needed to do that?
Right.
And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess let's put it this way. One is that the connectedness of the world means that when things go viral, they can go viral in a bigger way.
Sure.
But the second point that I guess that you're getting at is the fact that there's a selection that can happen in terms of what I see and what, I've got all this news coming at me, and now you need filters, you need some sort of systems, algorithms and so forth to be deciding what gets shown on your news feed and which messages get through or prioritized or put in which mailboxes, et cetera. And those things, they're designed to sort of, even if they're just designed in some simple feedback where the more you like a particular thing or the more you're clicking on things, then the more they show you those kinds of things. That kind of reinforcement has an effect that means that now the stuff that's getting through is somehow being selected off of what we were choosing in ways that wasn't necessarily true historically. So historically, it might have been that the information coming to me was just what filtered naturally through from my friends and so forth, and there were fewer individuals and there were people I trusted, and now it's the stuff that might be more sensational and
interesting. So in the past you might have not seen in the first place this kind of like fringe sensational stuff. But if you did, you might have clicked on it once and then, or exposed yourself to it once, read a newspaper article that you picked up on a tabloid somewhere, and then your friends in your more structured network would come and say, well, have you read this really great article in the Wall Street Journal? And you'd go back to content that was a bit more careful and curated, and so you wouldn't have that reinforcement. Interesting. Interesting.
And instead now you can even be getting it from the same, it could be the same story just under different disguises. You liked reading about story X, and now they show you from another source and then you begin to naturally we're counters deep down in our brains, and we start seeing the same story over and over and over, and that starts to leave an impression on us.
For sure. So one of the things that is interesting to me there is in that dynamic where now maybe my close ties are not the direct providers of my information, or even some of my weak ties, there's like very little chance I get some of their information. What does that do to the ties, the strength of the ties between people? So in the past, if I had told you a story, or I said, I read this article and you should go look into this thing, and then you looked into it and you found it very interesting, I get some benefit from that, and we get some benefit from that interaction. And I think maybe the accumulation of those kind of interactions in daily life, not just about information, but me helping you, you helping me, me introducing you to people, can kind of accumulate into what we generally call sort of social capital, although that's inclusive of other things as well. What are the effects of replacing the normal human ties and the normal interactions that we would have had historically before information technologies with information technologies that may divorce us now from that network? Do you think that there are effects on social capital of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it's changing a lot of things. So one is that the way in which we think of word of mouth is changing, and you can even see, I don't know, you just go into a restaurant and see people sitting across from each other, and instead of talking, they're each clicking on a phone. And
saw that on the train this morning.
It's quite typical, right? And so that means that there's somehow less personal communication going on in a face-to-face level. It's going on somehow. People are often communicating, but that's changing the arrays of things, and I'm not quite sure exactly how it all plays out. I think one thing that you do see, and I think is probably the most disturbing part of the way in which we get sort of inundated with news, is that when we think of the way that investigative reporting used to work. So think of what journalism used to mean. Journalism, so if I really wanted news, I would buy it from a source. And that was sort of a trusted source.
Yeah, the journalist would go in, and they'd go in with a team of journalists and tens of thousands of dollars spent on doing all of the source tracing and lots of work, at the end of which they could sell that.
Exactly. And that investigative reporting is really important to democracy and sort of making sure that systems are working well and there's not corruption.
Information checks and balances, yes.
Exactly. Yeah. And now, somebody reports a story, and instantly can be, like a minute later, it can be on some other news source where they quote, loosely the story as reported by X. This is happening, and
I've seen that many times now.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you basically just have the dilution of the intellectual product that was created, and then the dilution of the incentive to create that product if it can be stolen. That's a very interesting point.
And so that kind of deep investigation and knowledge and fact checking, that sort of thing, is the stuff that's really under fire, I think, from the fact that we're getting rapid communication from lots of people, and we can get maybe lots more superficial information.
Right. I mean, there's a pressure. If the end of the game is what brings most clicks, then there's a pressure to kind of leverage some of the more, dopaminergic response functions that we have as humans, where it's like, oh, I can't really, that clickbait, And even that process, much less the spreading of the information and the dilution of the credit of creating that information, all of that is not very, I'm not very hopeful about that dynamic. But kind of if you take the integral of that over time, and you say, okay, well, we can talk about fewer checks and balances on the government, for example, because of less investigative reporting, and we can talk about the increase in ADD-like behavior in the sense that we are now increasingly designed to find information that is very sexy to us, click on that information, get bored with it quickly, click on the next sexy information, maybe not get the same interactions that we used to have in our social networks. I, at least, am somewhat concerned about what this accumulates into for social capital. Bob Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, talked about this with respect to the TV, and it just seems to me, at least, that the TV is so small relatively to the amount of information change and the change in our social networks that we've undergone. It diluted maybe the magnitude of the number of our interactions, but when we did interact, didn't necessarily dramatically change the way we had historically interacted. So all of that is to kind of lead into a more hypothetical and skeptical, more hypothetical and future-looking question, which is, right now, these algorithms that are doing all of this are, in the grand scheme of things, fairly simplistic. Now, they are big neural nets and they've got many layers and we can't interpret them because of that, but they're certainly no AGI. They're just standard surface fitters and things like that. What happens when our social networks are being mediated by increasingly advanced AIs that are able to start not just finding information out there and promoting it, but actually generating content and fitting our interests and desires, our personalized interests and desires, to what we would like to see? So is there some world, maybe not too far in the future, where we're not just getting information promoted to us, but that's still generated in some way by humans, but actually these algorithms are learning to tell us what we want to know about the world?
No, that's frightening. I mean, I guess, one difficulty is that to some extent we're beings that are prone to addictions. And,
we are very much so,
We seek certain kinds of stimuli, and if we're designing systems that are meant to please us, then they can figure out what buttons to push and what order to push them in and how to keep pushing them. And that's something to be concerned about. I mean, I think that, when I think about it, the really encouraging thing about the change in the availability of information and the spread of it and the way it's moving is sort of the leveler of the playing field internationally. So,
Definitely.
you know, if I'm in a remote area in India or, you know, somewhere in Africa, I actually have some access to the internet in some cases.
Yeah, and information.
And information that I didn't used to have. And so that sort of replaces some social capital that, you know, in this rich society, it's going to disrupt social capital in one way, but in very poor societies where your social capital was extremely limited and not very productive, it can give you, you know, part of what we get through our interactions is information and ability to process that information and figure out opportunities and figure out the ways to make our lives better. And
so that's a very interesting point about the ways that added information communication technologies in developing countries. I used to do a lot of field work in sub-Saharan Africa, have and are pretty dramatically revolutionizing the information environment there. And that I would agree is a good thing. Do you think that there are ways that AI can be used positively to augment social capital in developed worlds? So in the US right now, I think, at least my assessment is that as it relates to the information environment, the AI that's been used so far, I wouldn't say on net has been used for social good.
Right.
Could it be? And what would that look like? Do you have any ideas about how you might?
Yeah. I mean, so I you know, it's always difficult to do social engineering.
Sure.
And very dangerous.
I would agree with that. Yes.
But there are certain things that we know. So, for instance, you know, when we look at how people get jobs, now most people get referrals. You get tips. You know, even academics get jobs. Advisors are important in putting people together and so forth. So there's a lot of reliance on this kind of very specific social capital. It's possible now that platforms like, you know, social platforms that connect people could start making connections that would allow people to have access to information and to other people that they wouldn't have had before.
So, and I think actually, interestingly, that was some of what the tech optimists were hoping for with respect to social media originally, right? It's that if you map the network, you can think about making connections that actually improve the overall social capital in the network by linking people together who may share this one interest and be different in a variety of different ways, and you can actually get some sort of contact-related benefit of having some Republican who's very interested in, I play harmonica, for example, very interested in harmonica with some Democrat who's interested in harmonica, and now they're playing harmonica together and reducing perhaps the innate polarization in the existing network. I think we've gone the opposite direction of that, unfortunately. But I think that hope maybe still exists out there. Do you think, given what you know about social networks, which is a lot, do you think that it would even be possible to come up with algorithms that could suggest the restructuring of networks that were not oriented towards pure homophily? So, you know, homophily is the easy way to go. It's just, here's somebody exactly like you, be friends with that person, now we have polarization. Is it possible to go against that?
Yeah, I mean, so I can give you an example where I know what you would want to do. So, for instance, we together with a team from MIT, Abhijit Banerjee, Chandrasekhar, and Esther Duflo, we did a bunch of studies in southern India where we were looking at diffusion of microfinance.
Okay.
So people are trying to find out about loans. They need to talk to their friends to get information about these loans, and word was spreading by word of mouth.
Yeah.
And there, the networks are really fractured along caste lines. So you've got pretty strong splits.
Yes.
And when you map out the networks, you can really see that there's certain groups that don't talk to each other. And if the first people to find out were all within one caste, the information would spread within one caste, but not across castes.
Interesting.
Okay, so that gives you pretty easy prescriptions of what to do. You know, you want to somehow build bridges across these caste lines where information can flow from one to another. And so the social capital somehow is stuck in a world where these people are just communicating inside these groups and not getting information across groups.
Yeah.
So you need to somehow build those bridges. that wouldn't. How do you do that? Well, that's tricky, especially in a world where caste is so ingrained in people's psyches.
You mentioned something in that comment that I wanted to focus a little bit more on, which was AI and the ability to link people to employers and to other, job-related connections. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the potential upshots of AI, is finding people. In that sense, homophily is good, right? You have a certain skill set. We're looking for that skill set. We want to match people on that. That's a positive thing. Yeah. There are other ways that AI might be detrimental to the human labor system in our country and in other countries around the world. And I wanted to chat a little bit about that, since you're an economist, and I know you're working on this topic. So what do you think are the risks that the labor system in the US faces from AI and from increasingly complex algorithms' ability to replace human services
I think, well, if you look at it historically, there's been different periods, say even in the US, where we've had the advent of technology sort of replacing human labor. So the big one, the first one was agriculture, right? So we went from 70% of our population living on farms to roughly 3%, 2 to 3% now.
Dramatic change.
Huge change. And we went through a depression during that time period. So if you look at the steepest part of that gradient, it's the depression, the Great Depression. Yep. Then you go through a period where manufacturing's big, and now manufacturing has been shrinking, and naturally because of replacement by technology, so that you don't need as many humans per unit of output.
And we went through a Great Recession around the time that was happening.
Yeah. And now we're going through a period where it even replaces us in services, right? So, you can do things, all sorts of things through programs that you used to have humans doing.
Yes.
And one thing that's happening as a result of that, and probably the most difficult thing to deal with, is that on the one hand, it's replacing low-skilled labor most rapidly, low and middle-skilled labor. So people who don't have high skills, they're not very well educated. These are jobs that are probably the easiest to replace and to automate, because they're fairly routine, simple kinds of tasks.
Right.
People who have high skills are more leveraged by these. Right? So people, if you think about somebody who's really good engineer or designer, they can be using computers to actually be much more productive and design more elaborate systems and to do calculations they couldn't do before. So on the one hand, you've got these people who are more productive and getting rewarded for it and higher salaries. And other people are being replaced, and people that used to be producing cars and steel or walking dogs, and that sort of thing means that you've got increasing inequality.
For sure.
And so you end up with this basic pressure, which is very strong, and is happening pretty much around the world.
Yeah. So one of the things that is very interesting to me on this topic is that, and I'm a political scientist, what we tend to do poorly is actually implement optimal economic policy. So, for example, with free trade agreements, it is the case that if implemented optimally, that will raise all boats. But the problem tends to be that you get free trade, and those who benefit from free trade, or for example from NAFTA, are the owners of capital, the more advanced skills. And then the people that are displaced are the ones whose skills are being supplanted elsewhere and offshore. Right. And the optimal policy is, okay, well, we tax those who have benefited and we redistribute that wealth to those who have been harmed, and they get to retrain and they get to have better lives because they're getting this redistribution of wealth. And that never happens. Or at least if it happens, it's very marginal, and it's in forms of retraining programs that we have a good amount of evidence now are not very effective, if effective at all. Mm-hmm. So this is this looks, from a political economy perspective, to me at least, a lot, the AI substitution of services and skills looks a lot to me like that. You have these winners, these owners of capital, the high-skilled people, as you say, and then you have losers. Right. And in the optimal economic policy, you would definitely have AI come in and replace these services, and you would just tax those who are benefiting more and redistribute the wealth. We don't redistribute wealth very effectively in this country anymore. Yeah. So what do we do about it?
Yeah.
Are we headed to a world in which we have clearly a upper class and a distinct lower class, and there is just no way to break through?
So yeah, a bunch of comments on that. I mean, it's so I think on the one hand, you know, what's different about trade versus this kind of technological displacement is in trade situations, industries that are being hurt can scream about it.
Yep.
And they scream about it to the government, they get some tariffs or protections for a while, and then there's a transition, and so it might happen over a period of decades. It sort of slows things down a little bit. It's not a solution by any means. With AI replacement, there's no way to sort of say, look, you know, stop the computers, let's stop software replacing, travel agents, let's change, let's slow this down. And
so even the very limited political recourses that harmed industries would have historically had and did have, the steel industry, for example, they don't have in this setting.
Yeah, and so that means it's sort of more rapid and can be a little tougher. What do we do about it? Well, I guess, there have been proposals of universal basic income and other kinds of things. Mm-hmm. I think that, people are becoming increasingly aware of this. I think when you look over the millennia, the last, say, 6 decades or so have been a little bit anomalous in the sense of having a middle class, and it's
dramatically anomalous in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, historically this sort of class divide and strong inequality in the world has been pronounced, and we sort of went through a period where inequality dipped.
Yeah.
It's gone up almost to the 1890 levels now again. So we're and it's not clear what the normal is and how you get there.
Now, that's inequality in the U.S. Global inequality, though?
China is way up.
Yeah.
It sort of depends on which countries you look at. Europe's up a little bit. UK, yeah. So
what about the inequality between the U.S. and China?
Yeah. So one thing that is probably the most positive of what's been going on is sort of, if you look at global inequality, you can see it going down a little bit in the sense that
I want to make note of the small positive bits.
I think it's actually a big positive bit, right?
Yeah.
So the number of people living below the poverty line has gone down dramatically. That's really good and very positive.
Yeah.
And that's a really big benefit from globalization.
So, we're talking about the solution in the U.S. Maybe there's a universal basic income. There's a lot of political economy reasons why I think that's going to be pretty hard to achieve.
Sure.
But one of the things that's very concerning to me from a global perspective, if you think about, China's catching up, for example, over the last few decades, China did that by using what they have in abundance, which was cheap labor, to leverage that cheap labor and get wealth coupled with the free trade agreements that we had with them. If we now have AI technologies that basically provide services at rates that no human can compete with, we have automation and we have AI technologies, and it's cheap, and it's below the sustenance wage of individuals.
Right.
Does that mean that the countries I've worked in sub-Saharan Africa that haven't yet made it past that ability to sell their labor, now that route towards development, is that cut off for them?
Yeah. That's a really tough question. I think it's hard to see a really positive way out for countries that are trying to supply labor and don't have the infrastructure to really supply higher education. If you look what's happening in China now, they are investing in research and education at a rate that just dwarfs everybody else, and it's having a huge impact really quickly. They're really developing high quality research, cutting edge research, making breakthroughs. That's happening. It's not clear that can happen in sub-Saharan Africa, right?
You need some level of initial capital to have that.
Yeah, and so that's going to take somebody from the outside probably going in and saying, look, we want to invest, and there's a lot of people with a lot of abilities here that aren't being realized, and we want to take advantage of that and make the investments that can help the country out. But that's sort of patronistic and not very likely in the short run.
Yeah. So you said something interesting in there, Matt, and it got me thinking about this sort of traditional neoclassical economics, Homo economicus, and how we as humans are really bad at being rational and making very rational economic calculations because we have all kinds of biases and all this evolutionary architecture that is with us. But it might be possible in the future to have algorithms be rational for us. And I'm kind of wondering what you think about that. Is it possible that, hey, I'm going to buy a house, I'm going to trade some finances, I'm going to go out and buy things at the market, and actually have algorithms that just do that well for me?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to think about the algorithms is as a tool.
Okay.
Right. So for instance, if you want to buy a house now, you've got machine learning that's gone out and figured out prices of all kinds of houses, and you can get really accurate predictions of what they are rather than having to rely on a realtor who might or might not be good at doing these kinds of calculations.
Yeah, very much so.
Or something which tells you how much of your budget is going in different directions, and that might have been hard to track before. So now you know where you're spending on which kinds of items, and you can re-optimize these things. So on the one level, it helps us a lot.
Cool.
The danger is sort of going on autopilot. The tools can't foresee everything, mm-hmm. and so they're programmed for certain kinds of settings and situations. And the more we go on autopilot, where we just delegate everything to the tools and don't really think through, is this the right tool for this particular situation, or are we going a little bit outside of its abilities?
We introduce some risks. So that brings to mind something that you have, a topic that you've also worked on, because you've worked on many topics, is sort of complex contagion and connectedness in the financial markets. And we are now pretty heavily using AI technologies in trading and in the financial markets. And as far as I can tell, to a large extent, sometimes it seems that those algorithms are indeed just kind of running, and as long as they produce the returns, then we let them run. What do you think about that? In a similar way that you'd be concerned about me just saying, oh, I've got 7 algorithms, I'm going to let them run, and my whole life is going to be run by 7 algorithms. If the financial system is being run by these algorithms that are opaque in the sense they're deep neural nets, we can't really understand why they're doing what they're doing. And there's a lot of them, and they're operating at faster than human capacity to even see what they're doing. They're huge speed. Are you worried about that?
Sure. I think maybe the first warning shot on that was long-term capital management, which I don't people even forget its bankruptcy a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, what happened there?
So that was one where they were running algorithms that were basically looking at spreads and certain exchange rates and interest rates, and part of the problem with using algorithms in this kind of setting is it was all based on historical data where there were certain patterns, and they were taking advantage of these patterns and then making huge trades. When things got a little bit out of line, they were arbitrage like crazy. So really leveraged enormous trades, and they were incredibly profitable. They were making 40, 50% returns.
Until they weren't.
Until suddenly, the world changed a little bit, and there were some political changes, and then you got a realignment of the way that these moved, and based on the historical data, the algorithms were doing what they were still thought they should be doing, mm-hmm. and suddenly, and instead of the spread, going in one direction, it just kept going in the opposite direction, and it was bankrupt within a short period of time. So that's one danger is these things are trained on certain data sets, and the world evolves, and you're not sure that they're making the right decisions all the time, and so you need some oversight. You need somebody who knows when is it that we pull the plug on a certain algorithm. The other thing is it can correlate things.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So imagine that we've got a bunch of different banks. We're all hiring people that are trained in the same ways, using the same algorithms. We know the same neural nets, cutting edge stuff. Mm-hmm. We all are basically looking at the same historical data. Now what does that mean? That means that we're all making more or less the same trades.
Yeah.
We think we're only the only ones making those trades, but a lot of us are making the same trades, investing in the same things. And now the markets start moving, even more and more in lock.
And what's the risk of that? What's the problem with that?
Well, the problem, when we think about the last financial crisis, everybody invested in subprime mortgage-backed
securities.
Yeah, you end up with a lot of exposure of many different parts of the system to more or less the same kinds of investments at the same time. And if those investments, don't pay out, you've got a lot of people exposed at the same time.
Yeah, it's correlated risk and possible financial collapse.
Yeah.
So are we going to have a financial collapse anytime soon?
I hope not. It's interesting. I think right now we're in a system. The good news about globalization is trade is spreading. As we talked about, world inequality overall is going down. We were more peaceful than ever before. So countries now have strong economic reasons to not fight with each other and to those are wonderful things. At the same time, a blip in one economy. Right now we've got the looming financial crisis in Italy that's being reported a little bit under the it's going to be a lot bigger than the Greek debt crisis probably, and when it hits,
it's been kicking around for a long time.
It's been kicking around for a long time, and that's because nobody wants to
actually deal with the undercapitalized banks. Is that a problem of undercapitalization of the banks still, or?
Yeah, I think part of it is that it's when you look at the world system now, once we have a lot of people having similar portfolios, having a lot of interconnectedness with each other so that they're exposed to each other's risks, if we don't have really good information about who the counterparties are and what that network looks like, there's a lot of chance that the investments can go south in a way that ends up being catastrophic. And I think a lot of central banks now are interested in understanding that, but I don't think they necessarily have, we're still dealing with sort of 19th century tools or even 18th century tools in terms of information collecting and accounting practices. Yeah. And the system, the kinds of stress tests that are being done are still very local, largely in their structure, and not looking at, I don't have to report. I can tell you what kinds of investments I don't have to tell you who I borrowed from.
Right.
And knowing exactly what that interconnection is vital to figuring out where the real exposures are.
So if we had better data, just trying to think again of the potential upside for AI.
Yeah.
Obviously, the global financial crises are very complex, and they exist in a really complex system, and even for the best financial analysts, very difficult to predict. But that may be because we're limited in our ability to fit that surface.
Right.
Do you think that there's any role for, once you have better data, it sounds like it's a data limitation, but if you were to have better data, do you think that we could come up with algorithms that could actually do a good job predicting the risk of contagion in those systems? And sort of like, hey, actually, we don't see it coming yet, but it looks like we're facing some sort of real risk of downturn.
Yeah. I do think that. I think the abilities to do simulations and to take to actually do alternative world simulations and see what would happen if that has gone up dramatically.
Okay.
And I would hope even say in Europe. They'll be able to collect information and understand the financial interconnectedness probably better and faster than anyone else.
Fingers crossed then.
Yeah. And that's the sort of thing that's necessary. Figuring out what you do about it and how you regulate something. You don't want to sort of put the brakes on a financial system.
Yeah, that can cause problems.
Yeah, so it's a delicate problem that it'll take a while to negotiate.
Interesting. One of the things is just changing up the topic of conversation a little bit, kind of getting back into ethics and discussion of values and discussion of what we started with, which is talking about the way that social media and social media companies can influence humans. You spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and you've been in Silicon Valley over the period really of the big tech boom that's occurred there, and Facebook becoming what it is and Google becoming what it is. Because these firms build their algorithms, and their algorithms engineer the platforms that we spend time on and the information that we see, are you concerned at all, or do you think that there is any reason to be concerned about the exporting of these firms' values, or of Silicon Valley values, or of US values to other people around the world? So embedded in any architecture choice is a value choice. And one of those for Facebook has been to maximize their revenues via the clicks that they get on their platform. That's a values choice. How do you feel about that? And maybe even more importantly, is there something that we can do to have more democratic input into the way that these systems operate, given that they have the large-scale impacts that they do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's several things that have happened and happened very rapidly. Is that these types of platforms have become enormous, and we have monopolies growing that at the rate that goes back to sort of, again, the 1890s, where you had the Rockefellers and Standard Oil, and now we're seeing it in the Silicon Valley, and we're seeing billionaires on the same order of that. And
should we start calling them tech barons?
Tech barons,
tech elite.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that when these things happen, you haven't really thought through all the ramifications, and as you're pointing out, when you design an algorithm, you're taking a stand on how that's going to influence people, and implicitly you're taking a stand whether you like it or not. And whether that ends up being beneficial for everybody, how it affects people is something that's very important. And you don't want to step in and regulate these things too much, but at the same time, the companies now are growing monopolies, and so they do have a huge amount of market power, and they're collecting a lot of information. They know a lot about it. Obviously people have become more and more concerned about privacy.
Yeah.
And I think it takes a while before the regulatory environment and the general population's awareness of these things catches up with the growth.
Certainly, I mean, in the oil baron period and the energy baron period, it took decades before there was any form of breaking up of those things.
Yeah. And here, there's real value in these large systems.
Yeah, exactly.
And being on these large networks, and so you want to make sure that you're not throwing the value out with.
Indeed, I mean, that was what I was going to ask next. Is if you think about Facebook, there's kind of a quasi-natural monopoly in making sure that you have the full network mapped. Right? Like if you have this broken up network and 50% of it is on one platform and 25% on another platform and 25% on another, you lose a lot of the value of the knowledge of what the full network looks like and the potential for using that for good, as we discussed earlier. So should Facebook not be broken up as a result of that? And if so, there are other kind of natural monopolies. If you think about the provision of electricity, for example, their networks are really valuable, and so we regulate them and make them effectively regulated state enterprises. Should we nationalize Facebook? Is it a natural monopoly such that the public good provided by having that natural monopoly needs to be highly regulated and basically run as a quasi-state enterprise?
Yeah, no, I think that there's sort of I think of it as two main issues.
Okay.
One is who owns the information that they're collecting, and I think that's fairly easily addressed in terms of legislative approaches, which would be basically to give everybody the rights to their own information.
Sure.
So for instance, right now, if I use Gmail, Google owns my mail.
It does.
So everything I've ever written on Gmail, that's literally owned.
Content.
All that stuff is, and every time I surf on Chrome or whatever, that's their information. So one is to make the default that that's my information, and they actually have to get permission in some way. That gets complicated, but changing the ownership rights would be one way to change the balance of power in that.
Sure.
But the second is that, as you're pointing out, there's huge network externalities and values to having one system and not having like a bunch of small ones.
Right.
And that naturally means that gives them some pricing power. And
Definitely.
Yeah, and that's harder to deal with and regulate.
It also gives them the ability to restrict entry, right? So it's almost inconceivable that some other firm could come up and steal enough of the network from Facebook such that you had a mass exodus from Facebook to this other firm because of the nature of the benefit of mapping the network and the fact that if you want to meet your friends, they're already on Facebook.
Yeah, exactly.
That's another criteria that we use for the nationalization of firms, or at least the heavy regulation of firms.
Yeah, I mean, usually if this kind of replacement would happen somehow over time by a different technology replacing, if you think of America Online, AOL, they had the sort of first broadband internet, but then once dial-up disappeared and we went through other means to connecting, then that sort of took away. So it might be that there's other ways in which people start interacting.
It's possible. I mean, we've had the technology of human social networks for hundreds of thousands of years now.
Yeah.
My hunch is that they're not going away anytime soon, although this is another speculative line of inquiry that I've been thinking about. What happens indeed when we come up with AGI or really complicated and complex AI where, and kind of related to what I was talking about earlier, they are able to fit the surface of our interests and provide us with that. But what happens if they start just being our friends instead? Yeah. I mean, it's funny to think about, but at some level, every person is just a complex surface that can be fitted, and the information that you're providing to me could theoretically be provided or synthesized via the ether out there of information and provided to me in a way that I'm enjoying even more than talking to you, which would be hard to do. But it's not too crazy of a world to think about something where now we just have our personal assistants, but they're also kind of our friends because they provide us with all the input that we want. They make us feel good. We get that dopaminergic response a lot. And we don't have to deal with the crap associated with dealing with human friends, like emotions and unpredictability and all the other stuff that humans have to deal with one another. Do we face a world, in a not too distant future in which indeed the technology underlying the existence of human social networks actually changes? Yeah,
I guess it's a question of that's poked a lot of science fiction writers.
Sure. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's probably not too far away that we'll have music produced that we enjoy more than that will really be excellent music, and books that can be written that will figure out how to. This is the book we really want to read, and
the book's co-written with AI.
And so that's sort of like the tip of the iceberg, I guess. And you're saying, okay, well, maybe they can actually replace our emotional needs and our
take it to the limit. Yeah, right?
Take it to the limit. And these are we all just sit in our pods and interact with.
Have you seen the movie WALL-E? At all?
Well,
it's a little back. Yeah. And how in that movie they have all these humans that are just sitting there like blobs, getting input. That's certainly a dystopia that I hope we can avoid. But the limit of the current. So if you take the trend and you take it to its limit, it's not too far away from that. We like stuff we like, and we want more of it, and we want to like it more, and we want more of what we like, and. It's not too hard to figure out what we like either. Facebook's doing a real good job with their AIs of mapping all the interests that we have and putting us all into our nice little brackets because we showed that we had interest in this or that. Yeah.
I guess it's hard to know. Part of it is maybe the deeper point behind your question is what's our objective function as humans? What are we really?
That's always my question.
I mean, sort of like what should we be aspiring to, and what in the long run, what would be good for the species and good for us as individuals as well, and is it just pure hedonic pleasure, or is there something deeper that we should be looking for? And I think somehow we all have this feeling that it's something deeper, that we don't want just our pleasure stimulated all the time and sit in pods and feel good. We actually want to be accomplishing something and advancing knowledge and learning, and that. I think if you think about a utopia where we've replaced all our basic needs and AI is our friend and making our lives easier. At some point, then that frees us up to be learning and exploring, right? So Star Trek kind of world where we're going out and exploring new frontiers, and that's what we do with our time, rather than, and that involves still getting back with other humans and somehow bonding.
Darn humans.
Yeah.
So okay, fantastic. I like tech optimism. I think that is a possible and optimistic world in which we are, just like with the change of agriculture. Given more time to do things with our free time and to become more self-actualized is what psychologists might call it.
Yeah.
But the search for that sort of self-actualization and the ability to look for more knowledge and the ability to even be trained well enough to search for more knowledge and to have all these positive interactions and these fulfilling things, in some ways conditioned on the ability to have time and knowledge to be able to access all of that. And earlier we talked about the real risk that we face of creating a very stratified society in which some people very much do have access to all of that, and so are indeed, as you put it, enabled by these AI technologies to become more self-fulfilled. When you don't have access to that, at least if you look at the data, this isn't just kind of an anecdotal data point, but risk of addiction to opiates in the opioid crisis that we're having is much higher if you're in a lower economic bracket for a variety of reasons that we understand from psychology. Do we run the risk of actually having two separate outcomes? One in which these AI technologies, for those who have access to knowledge and training, et cetera, and resources, do just really augment our self-actualization. But then for others, it's sort of, a very standard concept of the Marxian opiate of the masses, where indeed you just don't have the necessary prerequisites infrastructurally, social capital-wise, to be able to get past that hump. And so you'll just accept the fact that these technologies can really produce a lot of dopamine for you and a lot of hedonic pleasure. And you get this pacification of the masses with AI, and also the enabling of the self-efficacy of those who are in the upper class.
Right.
That's a scary world.
It is a scary world. I don't know. We are confronted with these issues already in terms of the class stratification.
Yes, definitely. It sounds like you're working on that question, so I expect a solution in a couple of months.
Any time now.
Yeah. So, okay, I wanted to close out by getting a little bit more into the weeds, because you're a top scientist, and I wanted to sort of probe one of the recent articles that you had published. And it relates to AI, and it relates to the use of AI in science, and more broadly how we think about leveraging information technology to learn new things about the world. And in this article, correct me where I'm wrong, you basically say, hey, look, we have this advent of big data in which we're collecting basically everything about all the people all the time, which is, that's what we're doing. And we also have these really great surface fitting algorithms that can tell us much more about the important features of that data than previously. Although we might not understand what exactly those features are, we can know how to predict certain things out of those data because we fit the surface effectively. And there are some that would say, hey, well, this is much better than we've ever been able to do before. Who needs theory? We don't need theory anymore to guide the questions that we're asking. We just have all the data, and we have massive algorithms that far outstrip our ability to fit these surfaces, and we use them, and we predict out of sample, and they work out of sample, and so we say, great, we've got prediction. And that's the goal of science, is prediction. But you say, no, there's a role for theory, and we need to not abandon theory. What's the basic argument in that paper that you advance?
I guess I'd put it in several ways. One is that when we think about predicting out of sample, really understanding what's going to happen in a fundamentally different world, that's hard, and you need some structure. If your algorithm is predicting what's going to happen in a completely different scenario than you have now, then somehow that means you've taken a stand within that algorithm of a model that's making forecasts of how these variables are going to interact in ways that aren't in the data.
Yeah.
And understanding what goes into that equation is vital. And it's really vital when we do things like policy. So you sort of say, okay, well, look, how can we help, eliminate inequality? And okay, well, suppose we put some policy in which does, some massive redistribution or a massive education program, something like that. Okay, well, that's not in the data. What do we think is going to happen? Well, we need to then understand how it is that people are making their choices and how this policy is likely to change those things. And so that's the kind of thing that, coupled with, good programs and models that we run on sophisticated computing technology, we can make predictions, but somehow we still need to have that theory and understand what it is that's the basic building blocks. And I think also just the complexity of where do we start? You know, what are the broken pieces, or what needs to be fixed? Those are things that are very difficult for a program to tell us. And so policy is one big thing. The other is that I think it's easy for us to look for surprising results and curious results, and data has all kinds of peculiar correlations that we didn't expect, and it's easy to get distracted. So I think that happened in finance to some extent. Finance has had the big data around for longer than anyone else.
Yeah.
You know, the minute by minute and second by second,
Sure.
nanosecond by nanosecond data has been around for decades. And, you know, that sort of drove a bunch of effects that people studied, the January effect, and
Yes.
the equity
Yeah.
premium, you know,
Yep.
a bunch of things that were sort of anomalies in the data. And somehow they're not necessarily as fundamental. You know, we learn things from exploring those, but, you know, you want to make sure that the data isn't sort of wagging the dog, right?
It's a good line. So one of I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate, though I think I largely agree with your points, but you know, just for the sake of argument. One of the things that seems to me to be pretty fundamentally different about these neural nets is the complexity of the surface that is being fit is most oftentimes like basically uninterpretable. In the context of like an ordinary least squares regression, it's like, oh, you have eighth order interaction terms and you're trying to interpret the coefficient on that substantively. Right. It's basically impossible to do that. And so one of the things that's very interesting to me is this idea that there are features and complexities of these systems that exceed our capacity to theorize well. And in fact, you know, we are in a complex system, and dynamics in that complex system, small things we might not at all think actually matter, but in fact they could matter when interacting with a bunch of other stuff. And as we do science as social scientists, we oftentimes don't even really think too complexly in terms of the interaction space. You know, we look at the marginal effect of this and the marginal effect of that, and that's really, if we do an interaction, it's a two-dimensional interaction and not much more than that. To me, it strikes me that we could be losing massive amounts of information that is useful in making decisions about how the system works, that because we're tied too closely to theory, we are a bit too rigid in only looking at the marginal effects of this and the marginal effects of that, and not realizing that actually, in order for this schooling intervention to be effective, it needs to sit in an environment in which it interacts with this variable just right and this variable just right. And so actually we should be much more concerned about physical activity of students than we are about the time that they're spending in front of a good quality teacher or something like that. I don't really know exactly how we translate that at all into policy. I think that's one of the biggest challenges because, again, it's fit on historical data. And so you could say this is very important historically in being able to predict how well students are doing, are these higher order interaction terms in this surface. But we have no idea if that persists into the future if we don't have theory.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, maybe at the simplest level, theory can help us think about which variables we include. You know, so you know, when you say fitting these surfaces and so forth, we could be putting in thousands of variables. So, for instance, if you start fitting it off all the information,
millions even, right?
Millions of variables, and at some level, there's probably a core group of them that'll be important. And if we have some labeling and understanding of what each thing means, even if we fit it in fewer variables that have less predictive power. So we ramp down the predictive power a little bit, but now we have variables that we can interpret. We say, okay, look here, I'm going to give you 10 things that I can interpret that it's working with, instead of millions of things that I really can't tell what all the interactions are. Then it's a little easier to start thinking about, okay, well, you know, I'm going to up this physical activity one, or I'm going to up the one of exposure to teacher, or you know, I'll keep track of those variables. And those now I can see as I change this one what happens. I can do marginal calculations, and somehow the theory just guides you in terms of, okay, what do I think, which variables do I think matter, how do they interact?
So the idea there is basically that you'd be willing to give off some accuracy in prediction for the interpretability of being able to actually implement something.
Right, understand it and then think about it in some way.
Yeah, you can do something about physical activity. You might not be able to do something about physical activity interacted with age of teacher, interacted with quality of teacher, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I have no idea how to interpret that, 8th level thing.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Well, thank you for your time today. It's been a fantastic, wide-ranging conversation over lots of very interesting things. I think kind of the most important things that stick out to me are the discussion of the ways that AI is increasingly mediating the interaction that we have in social networks and potentially influencing the social capital that results from these long-term processes. And also talking a lot about the way that AI technologies might influence the labor force and subsequent inequality. And what do we do as a society about the effects of AI on the structure of our societies? So, Matt, thanks again for joining me today, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in the future.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks a lot.